Good afternoon. I'm Brian Edlin, and today we're going to be talking about the ABCs of casualty claims for homeowners associations. I'm really excited to be here today with a number of people who have a tremendous amount of experience in this industry. Andrew Bateman is a community insurance and risk management specialist. Brooke Tidwell with Professional Properties Management of PPM is a professional community association manager. And then I'm also joined today with Austin Thompson from Restore Pro Reconstruction. Austin is works with Restore Pro Reconstruction and does multifamily housing, Class A commercial space, senior living, and also HOA casualty claims. So we're really excited to be here today to go over the ABCs of casualty claims for homeowners associations. There's a lot to get done today. We're going to try to tackle it all in about 45 minutes and then hold the rest of the time for questions, which we hope you will have some. But without further ado, I'm going to start with the law. We're going to talk about the law. We're going to talk about the insurance requirements. Andrew Bateman is going to talk about insurance. And then we're going to talk about a disaster plan and then launching that disaster plan and some practical pointers for how to implement the disaster plan that your homeowners association may have. So let's start with the statutes. First, the three statutes that are most applicable here are Chapter 47C. That's the Condominium Act, as many of you know. And then there's Chapter 47F, which is the Planned Community Act, and then Chapter 47A. Now, Chapter 47A is the Unit Ownership Act, and it's applicable to pre-1986 communities. Chapter 47C is applicable to condominiums formed after 1986, and it's also applicable to a number of older condominiums as well in some respects. For purposes of today, we're really going to hone in on one statute in Chapter 47C, and that is 47C 3-113. And the important things to remember about casualty insurance for condominiums is, first, that a condominium association has a legal obligation under Chapter 47C 3-113 to procure property insurance on the common elements, insuring against all risk of direct physical loss commonly insured against, including fire and extended coverage perils. So that's common elements. And what is fire and extended coverage perils? Well, fire and extended coverage perils, fire is fire. We all know what fire is, of course. Extended coverage perils would include windstorm, hail, and smoke damage. It also could include riot, civil commotion, aircraft, and vehicles as well. But those are extended coverage perils, and Andrew Bateman can talk to you more about that in a minute. The insurance that is required under 47C is 80% of the replacement cost of the insured property at the time the insurance is purchased. So what does that mean? It means that you have to have a valuation of the value of the property. And so Andrew will talk about that as well. But the statute requires insurance in the amount of 80% of the replacement cost of the insured property. One thing that's unique about condominiums is whether you have to insure the units. The short answer to that is that if there is horizontal boundaries, meaning a vertical stacked condominium, then the units have to be insured. If it's not a stacked condominium or a condominium without horizontal boundaries, then the units do not have to be insured. So that is one important distinction with respect to insurance and condominiums. Now, there are a number of other provisions in the Condominium Act as well, which we'll talk about. But 47F, getting to that applies to planned communities and townhomes. Townhomes and planned communities are governed by 47F 3-113 when it comes to insurance. And that is very similar to 47C in that it requires insurance on the common elements. And also the insurance has to be in the amount of 80% of the replacement cost of the insured property, which is the common elements. So for 47F communities, that's a requirement by law to insure the common area, which typically is a clubhouse or actual buildings that are on common area that are owned by the association. That's typically the case.
Hey, Brian, let me ask you a quick question in regards to, you said 80% replacement cost twice now in regards to 47C. Now you're under 47F. What does that mean with the other 20%? Who pays for that if it's not required by insurance?
That's a great question. So that would be a lack of insurance, obviously. So that would probably be a common expense when you're dealing with the common area. So it would be a common expense, and it would be distributed amongst all the owners in accordance with their allocations in the declaration. It's a great question. So 47A is another statute. It applies to pre-1986 communities, and that is an important statute as well. It requires insurance on the property, and it also has a procedure for rebuilding the property if there is a casualty loss. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some murky claim issues here where it's just not sure, maybe insurance is not available or it's not available at a reasonable price. And so sometimes there aren't answers to questions. And so we always fall back on Chapter 55A, which is our fiduciary duties of board members, which is to act in good faith and with the care of an ordinarily prudent person in a like position would exercise under similar circumstances. And where there is a doubt about insurance, it is important to keep that overriding concept in mind, is that we all have a duty to act in good faith with the care of an ordinarily prudent person. All board members in any event. So next slide. I didn't realize that so this is the language from the statute. It is property insurance on the common elements insured against all risks of direct physical loss, including fire and extended coverage perils. The total amount of the insurance after application of the deductibles has to be not less than 80% of the replacement cost. And as Andrew was just saying, the balance, if you only have 80% of the replacement cost, would most of the times be a common expense. Can you flip to the next slide? In the case of a building having horizontal boundaries, so here you have a condominium structure that is, as you can see, is vertical and it has horizontal boundaries. In the case of a building having horizontal boundaries, then the casualty insurance has to include the units, but need not include improvements or betterments installed by the unit owners. So oftentimes questions come up where an owner has added certain flooring, made certain upgrades to the interior of the unit, and the question is whether the insurance extends to that. The statute only requires the insurance on the units, but it specifically exempts from that insurance betterments and improvements. So next slide. So for pre-1986 condominiums, older condominiums, the manager or the board of directors, it says, if required by the declaration, shall have the authority to and shall obtain insurance for the property against loss or damage by fire and such other hazards under such terms and for amounts as shall be required or requested. This is where we get into some murkier issues in pre-1986 condos, where sometimes the declarations are not worded very well, and sometimes the obligation to insure is unclear. And that's why it's important to fall back on the statute that I previously talked about, which requires board members to act in good faith and with the care of an ordinarily prudent person in similar circumstances. This is the statute from the Planned Community Act, which requires property insurance on the common elements, and again, in the amount of 80% of the replacement cost of the insured property. And then the next slide is going to be Andrew Bateman, and he's going to talk about the types of insurance.
Thank you, Brian, for setting our stage with the state statutes. Associations need to have information to be able to make a business decision. Every association each year should be getting the information on the cost, coverages, and risks associated with a minimum of 6 policies, if not 8 or more. Of course, there's property, general liability, D&O, crime, workers' compensation, mainly to cover volunteers. But if you have employees, you're required always would we recommend carrying workers' comp if you have employees and associations and an umbrella. The other are getting information in regards to earthquake and flood. As everybody is feeling the changes in the insurance industry basically for the last year has been hardening. Well, what does that mean? It means that the insurance is getting more and more difficult to get, stricter underwriting guidelines, and the premiums are increasing dramatically. Some contributing factors to the hardening of the market are insurance companies are having nuclear verdicts going against them, where they're paying $10 million or more in jury awarded damages. Another is private equity firms are searching out accidents and situations and funding them through private equity and causing an extreme increase in defense and damage costs. The other is insurance companies are feeling higher inflation also. Claims costs are rising due to, as everybody is seeing, the replacement costs are rising. Well, that is increasing the costs of the claims themselves. The other is massive disasters, massive natural disasters. In 2022, we had Hurricane Ian that hit the East Coast, mainly Florida, but it caused over $50 billion in damage. I have a question for my panelists. Do you know the largest natural disaster ever to hit the United States? No guesses? All right, I'll tell you. It was Winter Storm Uri in February of 2021. It hit the south central of America, mainly in Texas, and it caused damages over $195 billion from a 4 to 5 day storm and the resulting damages and power outages. These are the things that are affecting the insurance industry, and that is affecting every association. Every association, with the information that they've gathered from their agent for their business decision, well, make sure that you're analyzing the risk for your association. Every association is absolutely different in number of homes, units, geographic location, amenities, building types, construction. The insurance needs to be formulated for your type of insurance. What is your biggest risk? Is the risk wind, water, cold weather? In North and South Carolina, the building codes for fire sprinkler systems have not been stringent in winterizing the fire sprinklers. And that's why we see this year it was Christmas Eve. Merry Christmas, everybody. That happened was a huge freezing incident in North Carolina. Board of directors, the number one thing that a board of directors can do is, of course, communicate. Do preventive measures and communicate to the unit owners what they can do to help prevent claims in the future. Those are hot water tanks bursting. That is your HVAC drain lines overflowing and leaking, supply lines, your washer and dryer, your toilets. And remember, any slow leak that happens for more than 14 days, an insurance company can exclude that claim because that is considered a maintenance issue, and maintenance is not covered by insurance. Use your professionals as a resource. Use your agent. Ask your agent to come out and do a loss control visit of the association. Insurance agents will be able to walk through the association and help the board of directors identify risk areas and help the association address them. The three things that every association regardless of what type of association it is, needs to have these three things done: accurate property insurance, concise governing documents, and know your claims process. Well, the way to get the most accurate replacement cost is to have an insurance appraisal done by an engineer. An engineer comes out and inspects the association for building materials, quality, wear and tear, and gives the most accurate per square foot replacement cost. But remember, each year at renewal, the board of directors has to sign a statement of values attesting that the property values are correct. Well, where's that information coming from? If you have an engineer do it, you've just transferred your risk to the engineer, and they will be able to provide the most accurate for it. The second is to get
Andrew, I just
Yes.
want to take a minute and jump in and remind our community managers on the call that when you receive those emails from your agent, make sure you forward them to the board of directors, right? Because the board of directors needs to be confirming that those valuations. That's not something that you want to take on and then get into a finger pointing contest when a claim occurs.
That's right. Excellent. You always want the board of directors review and sign those. And if they have questions, it's the board of directors' duty to ask. The insurance appraisals do cost money. We do recommend that the same engineer that you had you do your reserve study should be the one to do the insurance appraisal because they're most familiar with the association. And it may be, yes, sir.
When you talk about appraisals, are we talking about, in the context of a homeowners association, are we talking about a clubhouse, that might have a gym in it or a pool? Or are we talking about maybe townhomes that could be worth hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars? What sorts of appraisals are we talking about here?
Well, you can always get an insurance appraisal for a clubhouse. Whenever there's property, you can get an insurance appraisal. This is for a townhome community with property or a condominium. Is where there are millions and millions and millions of dollars at stake, and that the margin of error could be drastic. And we want to have the absolute most accurate. And that's why we have an engineer go out and put their eyes on.
And I think it's probably important maybe to mention at that point that the obligation to insure the townhome structures, which could be millions of dollars in the aggregate, is really dependent on the legal documents, right? The declaration.
Yes, sir. It's because townhomes could be considered single-family homes where the unit owners insure it themselves, or it could be a master policy that covers the building itself. Of course, in every governing documents, they're going to be different. And the next slide is going to be when we're going to talk about the importance of the concise governing documents. Another way to get an insurance or a replacement value is an estimation from your agent. This is where assumptions are made, but it does provide a per square foot replacement cost, but it takes into assumptions of quality, no account for wear and tear, like an engineer would be if they put their eyes on it. The second is asking a local contractor or the property builder from years ago who actually built it. And what they're going to do is provide a lucky guess, because you need the most precise as you can get. The biggest thing is your board of directors need to ask the questions of the agent. Where are these numbers coming from? Where did they come from? Where can we get them? As Brian just said, we need to have concise governing documents. The insurance, when you look at any insurance policy that has property coverage on it, it doesn't outline what is covered. It is very much a blank slate with a dollar value of replacement coverage. What drives the insurance policy is the governing documents. The governing documents are the written contract that the insurance has to follow at time of claim. So if it is not clear or concise, we highly recommend that you reach out to an attorney to get that opinion of how the governing documents read, or go through the process of having your documents amended. The things that need to be covered is, well, what is covered? Because then it's clearly helps eliminate the gap of what the unit owner needs to cover. But also you want to make sure that it's crystal clear on how the deductible is, whether it's assessed back to the unit owner as a charge back for construction, or is it going to be a common expense? I always like that it needs to be back as a deductible charge back to the unit owner because it gives them skin in the game.
Andrew, is there can you explain what an HO6 policy is in the context of a condominium association?
Yes. In layman's term, an HO6 policy is a condominium policy. This is one that you can add and subtract coverages to it. But one of the main things it does have is dwelling A property coverage on the HO6, even though it's designed for condominium. This is how you get coverage for the interior of a unit or the improvements or betterments, like your flooring, your countertops, your cabinetries, you've done a major upgrade in your bathroom or the kitchen. It's all covered on the HO6 policy for a condominium. And that HO6 policy will work very well on a townhome that has property also. It functions the same way. Every agency and insurance company has a different claims process. You better know what your agent is going to be expected to do at time of claim. Is your agent just going to give you a 1-800 number and say, hey, here's a 1-800 number, don't call me, call the 1-800 number? Or is the agency going to participate and help with this claim process all the way through? The biggest things that the agent can help with is communication. Sometimes the adjuster is busy and it's not top of their priority. Well, it's our job to help out. Give that adjuster a swift kick in the pants to get them moving again. Get that responses better. But sometimes there's an impasse between the contractor and the adjuster. They just don't meet and don't agree with what the per square foot replacement cost is for the flooring. Use your agent or the agency to help that communication process. Get them to talk, make them talk, and come to an agreement to keep this claim moving in a timely manner. It does take time, but you want to make sure it's still moving in a very timely manner.
All right, thank you, Andrew. So as Andrew said, you want to look to the governing documents. One thing that is a constant under both Chapter 47C and 47F is that the common area has to be insured, has to have casualty insurance. Where it becomes more complicated, of course, as Andrew was saying, and where checking your governing documents becomes absolutely critical is in the context of for instance, a townhome association, where you may not only be obligated to insure the common elements, but you could also very well have to have casualty insurance on the townhome structures themselves. And so that becomes very important that you look at your governing documents. One case that we have in the condominium setting is whether or not a Court of Appeals case from 2018 is under the Condominium Act, whether or not a condominium association has an obligation to obtain flood insurance in a FEMA designated flood zone. And in the Porter versus Beaver Dam Run case in 2018, the Court of Appeals said that the association had an obligation to provide casualty insurance on a certain portion of condominiums that happened to be in a FEMA designated flood zone where it was reasonably available. The statute specifically mentions availability 3 times in the Condominium Act. So it says 3 times: to the extent available, to the extent reasonably available, reasonably available. Those phrases are used over and over in the Condominium Act. So the appellate court in the 2018 Beaver Dam case said that the obligation to provide flood insurance was not absolute, and it was only to the extent reasonably available. And so that can get into somewhat of a fight on that sometimes, depending on the cost of it in your particular situation.
It's certainly a very, very broad statement saying reasonably available. I get asked that all the time. Is it because the premium has increased 30%? Is it because it doubled? Is it because it's tripled? It's a difficult situation, and
It is. It is. And it's ripe for litigation, depending on the circumstances. But this is a good segue. One of the obligations in both the Condominium Act as well as the Planned Community Act is to rebuild. Okay, so under the law, under 47C, any portion of the condominium for which insurance is required shall be repaired or replaced promptly by the association unless the condominium is terminated or it's illegal or 80% of the unit owners vote not to rebuild. So, and there's a similar provision in the Planned Community Act as well. And so there is an obligation for the association to rebuild, and specifically the statute says that the insurance proceeds has to be adjusted by the association. So the association is involved in the claims process. So that makes Brooke and Austin, their role in this crucially important in adjusting this claims process here. So we're going to hear now from Brooke and Austin on the management side and what it's like to adjust a claim and what some best practices are for setting up a disaster management plan and then implementing that plan when disaster strikes.
Great, thank you guys. One of my favorite things about my job is that I've got some really great resources, but I don't have to be the end all be all in terms of being an insurance or legal expert. Where a professional management company really comes in handy as being that cohesive part that brings it all together and works to coordinate with the board of directors and the different industry professionals to get your end result. So I recognize that there are probably board members that do not have professional management companies on this call. And that's, just that much more of a burden for boards that are not working with professional management companies. So I think what I'm going to go over is really applicable in both cases, but it is going to be geared more towards management companies or those communities that are working with management companies. First and foremost, make sure to familiarize yourself with the verbiage in your management agreement. There should be verbiage in there that allows your agent to make emergency repairs in order to mitigate any damages that may be occurring. That would typically be, of course, in excess of what their authorized spending limit is within the management contract. So just familiarize yourself with that and make sure that you're all on the same page about the fact that you're authorizing somebody to spend that money to mitigate any damages. Another best practice, of course, is reserve study updates every 3 to 5 years. This is something that we encourage across the board, regardless of insurance claims or not. It's just best practice. But as it relates to this topic, this is one of those areas that's going to help maintain an accurate list of your common elements, their current condition, and associated costs. And Andrew and I were talking, this would be also a great opportunity if you did want to get an appraisal by an engineer. You might be able to save a little bit of money by doing that at the same time you're getting a reserve study update. So that's just something to consider. At the very least, make sure that you have documented, with photos, those common areas so that you've got at least something to fall back on. A side note, if any of you out there have a community with a lake dam, there may be an emergency action plan that's required for that. So again, that's something that the board and management should be reviewing and updating periodically, similar to a reserve study. Another thing that can be forgotten at times is to make sure that you're promptly adding insurance to any capital improvements that you're making to the property. So if it's a new feature or perhaps an upgrade, make sure that that's captured in the insurance policy at the time that that's added. Another best practice is just to go ahead and proactively work with a restoration company to get a service agreement in place. Austin's going to talk a little bit more about what that encompasses, but that's just a proactive tool so that in the event something does happen, you guys can hit the ground running. And then finally, every management company probably has a slightly different way of how we deal with our on-call emergencies, but however you do it, make sure that all of the information is updated in your on-call system. So this would be access codes, vendor contact information, and board member information, because you're going to need all of that in a very short period of time in the event an emergency occurs. So kind of pivoting from board member best practices to resident communication. To the extent possible, it's going to be best to maintain a property owner and tenant list with current contact information. When we're dealing with an emergency, things are time sensitive. And so being able to communicate with property owners and tenants in a timely manner is really crucial in order to help mitigate whatever damage is going to occur. One thing that we love our agents for at PPM is that for our communities that do provide or are responsible for providing insurance coverage to a more extensive level, like at townhomes or condominiums, we'll have our agents actually prepare a memo that we can post on the website and maybe, push out once a year, but it's like the static document that's available to residents and tenants. And it really outlines what's covered by the association, what coverage is recommended for the tenant and unit owner, and it'll confirm the deductible and also who is responsible for that. So pivoting back to what Andrew said, I agree it's best practice if you are able to make the unit owners partially responsible for that deductible, if not fully responsible, so they have some skin in the game at the time that a claim occurs. But all of those things should really be outlined and shared with the community prior to a claim so that there's no questions on the back end about what's going to be covered.
And then Brooke, could I just ask you just briefly kind of chime in there and on the deductibility issue, that's particularly important, at least I see in my practice with condominium owners, is whether or not, because there's a blanket casualty policy on the entire building, and there's a $5,000 or $10,000 deductible, and there's a loss inside of the unit. And then there's the issue of how does the deductible get allocated, particularly when there's multiple units and they're affected differently. How do you allocate that deductible? And really, that's a creature of going to the declaration and looking at the declaration and seeing how it's allocated in the declaration, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it's a little bit of work up front, but if you're working with a good attorney and a good insurance agent and a good management company, they're going to put that together for you in a document that really you're only going to need to update as the board decides to change their policies on things. Maybe they increase the deductible or whatever, but this is just a one-time thing that is going to really be beneficial for everybody in the long run. And I was just going to say, following an event, of course, regular updates to the community or whoever's specifically affected is going to be, will help. They're going to call you either way, so you may as well proactively push it out. And that is it from a resident communication perspective. Austin's going to jump into, we referred to mitigation, but he's going to speak to that a little bit more specifically, as well as a disaster plan. And then we can jump into what happens at the time to file a claim.
Thanks, Brooke. Hey, everyone. Now over to the restoration side. The side nobody wants to have to call, but you always want to be prepared to have a preferred restoration company on file, because as everyone knows, disasters do happen. And you just need to be prepared for when they do happen. Kind of Brooke briefly touched on mitigation, but kind of going to explain kind of the differences between mitigation versus reconstruction. Mitigation is the process of reducing the severity of that disaster, and it's from keeping your structure getting worse, right? So condos, townhomes, apartments, no matter what it is, we want to make sure that once that disaster happens, we're on site as quick as possible to keep the structure from getting worse. Some of the mitigation services that would happen would be like water extraction, carpet pad being pulled, tile being pulled up, cleaning and disinfecting, boarding up broken windows to keep out animals and other elements that can happen from a natural disaster, and then utilizing roof tarps as well. So that really kind of covers, kind of the standard side of mitigation for when we come out. And one of the big things that I like to touch there is that minutes matter. You'll hear that a lot from us, is that we need to be on site as quick as possible. And the reason for that is it's just going to save on everyone's bottom line in the end all. Now, kind of going over to the reconstruction side, this obviously happens after mitigation. This is aimed to repair or replace the damaged items to their pre-disaster condition. So it's pretty straightforward. we're going to come out and provide what we would call 3D Matterporting scans. Then from there, we'd be able to provide a repair estimate to bring the structure back to the way it was before the disaster. Now the disaster plan. We, as Brooke kind of mentioned in her previous slides, we talked about a service agreement. We at least ask for a service agreement to be in place with a restoration company, or at minimum a relationship, right? Going back to those minutes matter. If a disaster happens and you guys don't have anybody to call, then you're scrambling last minute during a catastrophic event to try to find a restoration company. And I can go ahead and tell you from experience, during a catastrophic event, every legit restoration company is going to be completely booked out. So making sure that you
I'm sorry, Austin, I was just going to add on the service agreement, is that something like having you have someone there in case disaster strikes?
Yeah, it's more of just like a verbal agreement, right? There's nothing binding. There's no contract that's saying you have to use Restore Pro or any other restoration company. It's really just a verbal agreement that you have, that you go over the disaster plan, based on, the event that happens. So it's just kind of some prep work in the beginning to make sure everybody's on the same page. That way we're not scrambling last minute to try to figure out the best way to work it out. So we always want to have something like that in place. The next thing that will happen when we show up on site to mitigate the problem is we always have to get a work authorization signed. I mean, this is huge. Our technicians are taught, our project managers are taught that they cannot start any of the work until the work authorization form is signed. Okay. Yes, Andrew.
$1 million question.
Yeah.
Who needs to sign that? Who's going to sign that?
Yeah. So most of the time it's going to be the HOA president or someone on the board that is authorized to sign that type of document. Great question. And then going from there, obviously, we just want to make sure that all parties have a full understanding of what that work authorization form agrees to, okay? And then kind of what we can do beforehand is make any adjustments, right, in part of the service agreement prior to the event of that work authorization form if necessary, okay? And then on the restoration side, we just want to make sure we have a full understanding of the insurance coverage, the policies, and the deductible. Okay. And then always want to make sure that we've got up-to-date billing and payment information as well. That's just not something you always want to track down at the last minute. Going from there, we're over to what a basic disaster plan is going to cover, what we call standard operating procedure for mitigation. Kind of the first thing that we'll talk about is response time, right? That's from the moment that you guys call, whether you're calling a business development manager or a project manager, the main hotline to make sure that we can get out there in a timely manner for you. From there, we would then go over obviously different liabilities that pop up, lead, asbestos, other environmental concerns like mold. And then from there, we'd be able to provide a scope of work. Okay, so we'd have a laid out document for you that we would be able to email over that provides all the details that we would go over with you to make sure we can get the work done in a timely manner. From there, we would be able to present mitigation timelines, how long we're going to need, time to set up drying equipment, how long we're going to need to come back out and do more moisture readings, and then, how long before we'd be able to send you another repair quote to get that taken care of. And one of the next biggest things, and Brooke kind of touched on this on her slides as well, is the communication chains. These are huge. We just want to make sure that obviously you have all communication kind of laid out, who needs to be updated first, whether that's residents, whether that's the HOA president. That way there's no delay of, somebody's not home or somebody's not answering the phone. We want to make sure that we've got all the communication chains tied up before we get started. And then kind of one of the last pieces of the disaster plan for the mitigation side is going to be drying certification. And this is huge for the insurance companies as well. We'll provide full documentation with moisture mapping and encircle reports that we'd be able to send to the HOA board of directors and the insurance companies as well, making sure that we provide all the dry certification reports. Now on to, we need to file a claim. Now what? And Brooke and I will kind of share this slide, but from a remediation standpoint, so for us reconstruction, you want to make sure that you've got an unlimited liability general contractor in North Carolina. Okay. Just like mitigation, we want to make sure we establish those communication chains. Okay, so there's no going back and forth. We know exactly who we need to communicate to. From there, like I mentioned, we would provide a repairs estimate, and that's through a 3D Matterporting scan, which will provide all of the costs for you. And then from there, we'd have a timeline for completion, and that's all to cover the repair side for bringing the structure back to whole.
Thanks, Austin. And I just want to say, you know, from a management standpoint, that having a plan in place is so helpful in terms of setting expectations up front. So a lot of these things are most likely going to be outlined in whatever agreement you sign with the remediation company. In the event that you don't have that, or even you do, it's going to be somewhat similar from a management standpoint. So at the time we're notified of an emergency that's caused property damage, our first priority is going to be to mitigate. So again, make sure you're familiar with what you're authorized to do and do it to minimize any damage that's going to be occurring on common property or property that the association is responsible for insuring. Then communicate with the board of directors, and of course first, and then any affected property owners or tenants. Next step would just be to file a claim. Again, if we're going into a situation where it might be a natural disaster that we can get ahead of, let's just go ahead and educate yourself on the claims process for your communities, so that you're not blindsided, but that would be your next step. And then again, just regular and proactive communication to your board members and any affected residents. Also just wanted to mention that just be prepared for board members to decide to make upgrades at the time that you do need to reconstruct. It's not unreasonable or uncommon for them to want to go ahead and do that. But of course, any upgrades would be at an additional cost to the association and not covered by insurance. But that's one extra piece of the puzzle that you may need to manage during that process. And I think with that, we're ready to jump into some scenarios. So Brian, I'll let you speak to scenario one, and then we can go through the others.
Sure. Thank you, Brooke. So as Austin was saying, sometimes you have to, when you're responding to a casualty loss in a homeowners association, he talked about the work authorization being signed by the president. Well, that is true when the association is responsible for reconstruction, or perhaps when it's an insurance trustee adjusting claims because there's an underlying legal obligation to provide insurance. However, in this case, this is a scenario, we want to go through some scenarios here and kind of elaborate on that a little bit, because the association is not always involved. This is an example, for instance, single family detached home, which is obviously not a townhome. There's a tree that has fallen on it. This is a casualty loss. It's a detached structure, and it would likely be owner insured. In most cases, the declaration will not provide the association insures this. The obligation would be on the owner to insure. The lender or the owner would likely have required it for casualty insurance. So the association is likely not going to be involved in this situation. That's going to be a situation where the owner contacts the restoration company, its insurance agent, and adjusts the claim himself or herself. So this one is pretty simple, but as we can see, it gets more and more complicated as you go on with the next slide.
Yeah, and that actually prompts me. One thing that we do, just kind of, you can switch to the next slide, but when we're getting ahead of natural disasters at PPM, and I'm sure other management companies do this as well, but we have a template that's drafted for kind of each type of community that we manage. So one that's kind of geared towards single families, one towards townhomes that the HOA provides insurance on, and et cetera. And so we will push these proactive communications out and just set the expectations with residents. So if it's a single family community, we're letting them know ahead of Hurricane Ian that the HOA is not going to be, assisting with claims on your personal property. We also like to set the expectation of how emergencies will be handled, because of course, if it is a natural disaster, there's a lot going on at once, and we're going to have to prioritize how we deal with emergencies. And so to the extent that you can get ahead of communicating that information, the easier it's going to be for everybody on the back end. But jumping into a more common scenario, as far as HOA involvement would be scenario number 2, where you're dealing with a casualty loss in an amenity center, in an amenity center. So this would be really kicking back to what I covered earlier in terms of steps for filing a claim. You're going to be doing mitigation first, and then communication with your board of directors. Then you're going to file your claim, and then it's just ongoing communication from there. So step 1 is always going to be mitigation. And to the extent that it's going to be beneficial for residents to be kept in the loop, go ahead and push out follow-up communication to the community and just let them know what's going on and what they can expect moving forward. And again, I think the more proactive you can be, the more efficient we can all do our jobs.
Thank you, Brooke. And so this leads us to the next scenario. Again, insurance and casualty losses in a common interest community. So this is going to be perhaps one of the more complicated situations because it's going to involve a number of parties potentially. It could involve as many as five parties: the homeowners association, the owners, the insurance company, the management company, and the restoration contractor. So this is a fire in a townhome, and there are adjoining structures. There's multiple townhomes that are potentially impacted here, and the insurance may or may not be by the association. There could be 2 situations here: one where the owners individually have their own insurance policies, or 2 where the association has a blanket casualty policy and insures all the townhomes. So it will be handled differently depending on which situation occurs. The association is obviously going to be much more involved if there's a blanket casualty policy on all the homes than it would if each individual owner had their own insurance policy. But this could be a potentially complicated situation, and it requires an immediate response by obviously emergency personnel, but then right after that, mitigation, like Austin was talking about. Right, Austin?
That's correct, Brian. Definitely, obviously, emergency teams need to come out first and make sure everything's safe. But then right after that, you need to have a restoration company out to provide mitigation services. That's going to, be debris removal. That's going to be board up and tarp up, depending on how bad the fire is. And then when all that is safe, it's coming back out and doing smoke and odor removal, setting ozone machines. And then from there, we'd be able to provide a repair quote to bring that townhome back to whole.
All right. And then the next scenario is another townhome community. Andrew, can you talk about this one?
Oh, yes. Now, I do want to make sure everybody, this is just a important point, that in the governing documents, there may be a maintenance requirement. It is completely separate and different than the insurance requirement. And so if there's a hail storm damages the roof and the exterior, a townhome may be insured as an individual home. So every unit owner will have their own adjuster. They will be adjusting that claim all the way through. If there is a master policy, there will be one adjuster that will adjust all of the roofs for the association if there's a master policy in there. I truly believe that townhomes should be insured by the individual unit owners. And yes, you heard an insurance agent say that, yes, you should have less insurance responsibility on the association side. I truly believe that because as the townhomes become older and older each year, they will have trouble getting insurance, and it becomes more and more expensive to do that. And claims could be happening in one building and not the other 20 buildings, but the whole association is going to pay the extra insurance premiums for that. So just keep that in mind. That is a great topic to discuss with your attorney and your manager and your insurance agent.
And for what it's worth, communities where the association is responsible for insurance, most likely you're going to see that reflected in your management fees, because you're going to be talking about a significant amount more time on contract for your community manager. So it's just another cost consideration when that comes up.
Yeah, excellent point.
And then, and this is the last scenario I think we have, right, guys? This is the dreaded water in a stacked condominium. So everybody's worst nightmare here. So a hot water heat bursts in a condominium. There are units below it, next to it, and multiple units can potentially be impacted here. So this raises a number of issues here. Access to the unit, the type of insurance involved, the importance of mitigation. Let's start with mitigation, Austin. What needs to happen in this situation?
Yeah, this is a very common situation that we probably deal with almost every day. So you just want to make sure, one, that you have access to all the units that possibly could be affected, right? If this happened on the 3rd floor, there's a very good chance that the 2nd and 1st floor can be affected as well. So it's very key, as Brooke mentioned, having those tenants below's information, to get a hold of them and have access to those units to check. But as far as mitigation is concerned, we're going to come in for a situation like this and extract the water, set up drying equipment, pulling that carpet back, pulling out the carpet pad, possibly with some of the baseboards being affected, pulling those off. If there's insulation in any of those walls and it got wet, we'd be taking the insulation out as well. And then setting drying equipment and then coming back in roughly about 48 to 72 hours to see where that mitigation process is.
And Austin, you just said that access to the unit. So I bet you were going to ask, do you have a legal right to get into the unit? Or maybe Brooke was going to ask that. I don't know.
Brian, you read my mind.
The answer is yes, they do. There likely is something in the declaration that deals with emergency access. If not, each unit owner has to afford the association, and when necessary, other unit owners access through his unit to the extent reasonably necessary for any maintenance, repair, or replacement activity of the common elements. So this clearly could be affecting the common elements. So there is a right of access under the Condominium Act to gain entry to this unit.
And in regards to the insurance, there is a duty to stop or limit the spread or increase of more damage. So those costs that are right at the beginning are normally included in claim expense and they'll be paid. That includes the mitigation from Austin, the tarping of roofs, anything that needs to be done to help stop the spread of damage is normally covered by insurance.
And the allocation of the deductible on this is going to be determined based on the legal documents, right?
Yes.
Well, I think that's it. So we appreciate everybody's tuning in to the ABCs of casualty claims. Obviously, a lot more questions here, a lot more issues that we could discuss, but I hope we covered the basics and we look forward to your questions.